Welcome to the First Case Expert Series. I'm your host, Melanie Perry, and joining us in the studio is our perioperative instrument coordination expert, Jeff Wertz. Jeff, so far we have gotten to know more about you. We have talked about the importance of communication and visibility within our departments, and we've talked about the people who were involved in the process. So where are we going next? What are we going to be talking about today?
Yeah, today we really want to go through gaining alignment on goals, kind of working between the different groups that we've set up. So primarily between, where we're starting from with what's most effective right now, probably SPD manager or someone from SPD coordinating with the OR, and someone from the OR, ideally doing some of those regular meetings, but understanding and getting alignment on the overall goals of what we're trying to accomplish and really getting to the why of what we're trying to align on.
And what is that exactly? What are we trying to align ourselves with?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So I think that this is unique to each facility. I think, like I told you, Melanie, I want to kind of flip some of this around on you and see, where in all the different facilities that you've been at, what are some of those challenges that require some of that gained or some of that buy-in between these departments of where you want to begin collaborating on? Because I think it's more so identifying a challenge and then getting into the why this is a challenge from both perspectives. Then you can start going into to collaborating on what we're going to be measuring, because you better understand where the other side is coming from.
Sure. One of the biggest challenges we had as far as getting buy-in for both sides and understanding at my last facility was with instrument scanning. It was very difficult to get the OR staff to understand that it was vital for that tray to be scanned before it left sterile processing. Even though they were in a hurry, yes, they needed it right now, either saving the sticker and getting somebody to scan it for them or just taking that scan gun and scanning it before they left, because we couldn't keep track of our trays and know where they were going if they weren't scanned. And so scanning was a place where we really struggled with our instrument tracking.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting kind of place to start from, because I think that inevitably is kind of what leads to a lot of challenges overall for if you're trying to collect information on error reporting. I know that's oftentimes a hot button topic or a challenge for a lot of facilities. So it may be that there's issues with instruments not coming up complete, or they have bioburden in those. And that's, I think, a really common one in a lot of facilities. So I think that's a really good kind of starting point, or the kind of tip of the iceberg, that then, you kind of jump to it right there of that is a result of what's our instrument scanning process and policy around that. How involved are we getting from each side? I think, in an ideal world, you have, an actual tracking system that you have something to scan. But again, we want to make sure that we're making this something that you can do whether or not you have the technology in place. So I think that this is a really good, point of review is, what can you do in the short term to be able to track that through the process? So who's responsible for reporting it? SPD isn't going to be in each one of the procedures, so there has to be some buy-in from the OR on that. What were some of the complaints or challenges that the OR team had, in that regard? So let's just say for this instance, we're the issue or the focus that we want to have is on error reporting. What have you seen as some of those challenges?
A lot of the time it had to do with, I don't have time. I'm in a hurry and I don't have time to keep track of the problems we had. I just need to fix it so that I can get on with my case. And whether we were talking about not having a tray available so that our case could start on time for the first case of the day, or if we had issues with trays later where we were running upstairs to grab new trays because the tray in the room had a hole or there was bioburden, all of these issues, it's like, I just need to fix it and let me just go fix the problem so that we can keep going. But remembering that to keep track of the data so that we can fix it in the future is also just as important, so that we don't have this problem again. But understanding why it's important to keep track of that data sometimes is lost in the moment just because you're in so much of a hurry to make sure that you can keep going. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. And I think, like in these discussions, I think it's important that both sides are explaining their challenges so that you're able to see that. Because I think, in working with a number of SPDs throughout the country, that, they're not looking for to be sending up trays that have errors with them. They want that to be communicated proactively. And I think that there's always a kind of struggle between those two of, well, you guys complained about it, but you haven't told us that there were issues until it's the worst possible time. I think that, this is a perfect point to be reviewing, because I think a lot of this ends up getting lost in the situations that I've seen. Is they have a manual process that requires multiple stakeholders participating and adding information. And a lot of times that information doesn't get compiled and shared and reviewed. And I think that kind of leads back to, all right, if we're doing this weekly, that in and of itself, maybe you take some of the time to just compile those things, and you haven't had time to do it, but we have this weekly meeting where you're going to actually do some of that and review it. And then gives you the opportunity to kind of refine the process and identify, all right, so these are some of the issues, and you can start digging down into what the challenges are. But I think that all stems from those conversations of, I wasn't communicated with these issues. And a lot of times, this might come up of just, oh, no one documented it. But I do remember that there was an issue in OR, Dr. Jones's case last Tuesday, and it starts to kind of unearth those challenges and create the line of communication. But again, the main focus here is to get that alignment of, hey, we're both trying to do this for the better. This isn't to negatively impact your team. It's really focusing on the positive of this, that we're going to get better overall, and managing the process through which that information is documented and reported, I think, is really crucial. And you don't get to that point unless you get some of that buy-in from everyone. So I think it's really going back to the why here. I think the error reporting is a really important one that you bring up, and also what you mentioned with just scanning and locations and things like that. I know that that's also just a challenge in the industry as a whole too, because SPDs have a whole process, or a lot of them have a competency built around how to communicate with the OR, because their experiences, they get a phone call and they say, hey, I need the mother-in-law clamp. And it's like, well, I'm a SPD tech and I don't know the language that you guys are speaking. And all of a sudden we're going down the wrong pathway right off the bat. But again, making sure that everyone's on the same page with, if we're communicating, we understand the end goal of this is to address scan locations, something along those lines. It creates a much more easy through point where you can get people to have buy-in in this process and monitor it and manage it.
You made me think while you were talking. I got to thinking, about the scanning issues that we would run into at my last facility, and then also about my struggles with keeping track of errors. And keeping track of errors, it's not about punishment, and it's not about, getting people in trouble because a mistake was made. It really is about tracking that data so that we can improve and we can get better. But scanning processes oftentimes, and the error reporting process, can be very burdensome and very cumbersome. And like my own experience, it was a headache for me to try to go back and collect the data, go get the stickers, go get the stuff, and turn it in and send the emails. And there was no set process. This week, we were sending emails at the end of the day for everything that was wrong. Next week, we were meeting every day at 1:30 to talk about it. The week after that, we were doing it on a weekly basis and compiling everything. And without consistency and without a set process, it is very challenging to get your team to really understand why, when it seems like it's changing every single week.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important piece too, is I think that there's a fine line between being flexible and changing a process based on what's going to work best. There has to be some of that alignment of, hey, it's not going to be easy on both sides, and we're both going to have to come to the what's the saying around a good negotiation is both sides are a little bit upset with what they had to give up in that process, but that's typically a good negotiation. And I think that that's important to get to of evaluating, hey, does it make sense for us to actually change this process? But it all goes back to the consistency that you're actually meeting and discussing. And I think also having the grace to understand, all right, we didn't get every single one of these reported, but this is why, this is what we want to consider changing so that it's more reliable. But I think that those are great points. And then I think the other thing that I didn't mention before is focusing on the wins of,
right.
Hey, if nothing was reported, that's what we've done in our system as well, is if nothing's reported, we're going to default to, hey, we did great, because there's no other information to suggest otherwise. And I think that's oftentimes where SPD can get really frustrated, is like, all of a sudden we're getting blamed for a bunch of stuff that we had no idea that happened. And we've been operating under the assumption that we're doing everything right. And we haven't had this communication to better manage it. And once you have some of that consistency in place, you're able to understand that there are some challenges, and then you're able to actually address it. But nothing's more frustrating when you just have some animosity built out that you didn't even know was building.
You're right. I've been on the receiving end of some of that animosity before as well, just because we didn't know. And then all of a sudden we find out, and it's this whole explosion of knowledge now that we're actually talking. But before we finish our conversation for today, because we have talked about some frustrations and some challenges, what about how we can positively reinforce and also showcase those wins so that people feel like they're really contributing to something valuable?
Yeah, I think that comes down to actually setting up something fun for the groups to actually collaborate and enjoy together. I think it's the SPD doesn't get a whole lot sent their way in the form of lunches and things like that. But I think that using those opportunities of those meetings to say, hey, if we were able to go 2 weeks without an error reported, or even just getting a good process in place, having some sort of incentive that takes some time away and builds some camaraderie between those departments. I think celebrating little wins along the way is probably the easiest way to say it, is not getting too far out in front and saying, all right, we have everything perfect. But again, even if you're just getting those meetings consistently set up and say, hey, like, just to set the baseline of that process and system of those meetings and say, hey, we do this for a month. We're going to buy coffee for everybody at the month end meeting. And then just setting small achievable goals along the way, and it allows you to have bigger wins down the road. But I think that's a critical point, is finding some of those small wins that you can focus on, and then work together to achieve the larger ones and refine your processes.
Yeah, and I think it's a constant refining, a constant looking at what's working, looking at what we're doing, taking the new data, and then changing and moving on. But we're always working towards being better. And I think that we start with, like you said, we start with what is working, and then take something small so that we see immediate wins. Everybody likes to see a win really quick, and then move on to the bigger stuff for sure. That is excellent advice and a great takeaway for our conversation today. And so as we've talked about getting our teams to understand the why so that we can get alignment on those goals, and we work with those small wins and those small victories to gain that buy-in from our teams. And now we're going to really look at what it is that we are measuring and monitoring in our next interview. So join us next time as we discuss inventory availability and utilization and continue our conversation with Jeff. Thank you for watching this week's episode of the First Case Expert Series.